For at least a little while, life would have been somewhat harmonious in Vault 94 from Fallout 76. You see, inside was an entire group of non-violent individuals, all hand-chosen for their uniquely pacifistic attitudes, mostly due to religious values. Even with cramped living quarters and no access to weapons to defend themselves, this vault carried on for years in relative prosperity with round-the-clock sermons and feel-good vibes. But little did the vault dwellers inside know that the real experiment of this place was only just about to begin. Because Vault 94's experiment was actually to see what would happen if non-violent pacifists were to come into contact with the outside wasteland post-war. Would happiness ensue, or something much, much worse? Well, as you probably guessed, this is Fallout, so it was the latter. After sending out some envoys to spread the news that the Vault dwellers wanted to help the wasteland and join with others allowing them inside to be healthy, in almost no time, a group of raiders caught wind. Making their way inside under the guise of being kind, once fully integrated, the raiders started to open fire and slaughtered all of the dwellers, who screamed and ran for their lives, asking their god how he could forsake them like this. But God heard their cries, and during this onslaught, some of the raiders accidentally triggered some technology in the Gek room, which set off a chain of events that ignited a nuclear bomb, instantly killing everyone and creating the mire we know from Fallout 76. Ironic that one of the most peaceful vaults was also home to one of the greatest weapons of mass destruction known to man. Among the pantheon of most recognizable Fallout vaults of all time, without question, somewhere near the top would be Vault 108 from Fallout 3. Affectionately known as the Gary Vault by most players, this hidden hideaway in the middle of the capital wasteland is more than meets the eye. When you first enter inside, you are met with gruesome scenes of blood and decay, along with some dead bodies, all of one man named Gary, all with different numbers behind their name. And shortly after this, you stumble upon an alive version of the same man, accompanied by many of his other brethren, all shouting Gary at the top of their lungs and looking to try and kill you in a manic rage. It's one of the most absurd, sad, and almost funny vaults in the entire franchise, and it all comes down to what happened inside years before. You see, Vault 108 was meant to house 500 residents for just under 40 years, but was also designed so that in year 20, most of the vault's power supply would fail. Along with this, all standard positions of power were left unfilled, instead to be chosen by the overseer themselves, and the overseer selected to start the project was someone with a rare form of cancer and only 3 years left to live. Essentially, the vault was designed to fail from the beginning, but even more interestingly, in those early years, an experiment began to take place in human cloning. Scientists in the vault began testing with highly new tech for human cloning trials, and their subject they chose to test with was a man named Gary. But with each iteration of him that they cloned, the clones would simply shout the word Gary and act very aggressively towards everyone inside. So because of this, the clones were all kept in a containment facility in the science room. But after getting to clone number 54, finally the Garys had had enough and rose up against their captors and took over the vault, slaughtering everyone inside and driving the rest of the survivors outside of the vault. When you arrive as the Vault Dweller in Fallout 3, the vault is now nothing but a horrible murder scene of the past, with an army of this one man Gary shouting his name as they chase you with baseball bats. You can even find creepy remnants of the past, like a fully barricaded woman's bathroom or blood smears on the wall, and tell the harrowing story of this vault that was losing power and the people inside hiding in darkness from this army of one deranged man, Gary. It's one of the strangest vaults in the series' history without question, but also maybe one of the coolest and funniest. And on top of that, the vault itself is super creepy and full of interesting lore, so in many ways is one of the best examples of a Fallout vault of all time, both horrifying and hilarious at the same time. And once again, it shows the insane lengths scientists in the Fallout series were willing to go to further their research, and reveals that the biggest monsters in the series aren't always super mutants or ghouls, but rather the human beings we all call friends. In fact, it even makes you wonder what other random side experiments could have been happening in other vaults that don't even directly pertain to the main directive. Maybe there's even some other vaults out there that have gone completely off the rails as well, not even due to the wishes of Vault Tech in the first place. Fallout is no stranger to insane human experimentation and crazy narratives, but not many reach the absolutely mind-blowing heights of the story behind Vault 22 from Fallout New Vegas. A facility that was originally constructed under the auspice of genetic and experimentation trials on crops and other plant life, but turned out to be so much more. You see, before the Great War kicked off the nuclear Armageddon and subsequent fallout in the series, the world of Fallout was actually going through a food shortage and famine. On top of rising tensions between the biggest nations in the world and battles breaking out everywhere, people were struggling to get enough food. And because of this, Vault-Tec set up Vault 22 as a main central stage for ongoing research into advanced fertilization and crop production, along with better performing pesticides. So when the doors first shut in 2077, the scientists assigned to the Vault got to work with their research, hoping to one day leave their lives behind in this cramped palace and come out with their findings on how to make better food in a new world. But part of the experiment taking place here involved lots of donations from rich pre-war clients and massive organizations, one of which was an entopomathogenic fungus designed for pest control. Funguses like this work by taking over a host body, in this case insects, and slowly taking over their mind and body, all while producing more spores that through airborne transmission reach new hosts. The insects infected with this affliction also die a gruesome death. And by the way, things like this actually exist in real life too. But nonetheless, on its own, this was no problem, as the scientists in Vault 22 were dealing with many similar fungi. Sadly though, in this case, the strange organism had actually been sent from Big MT's X-22 Botanical Garden, a nearby highly funded research facility shrouded in secrecy. Unbeknownst to the Vault dwellers, this fungus could not only infect insects, but also human beings too. At first, it was only bouts of pneumonia and problems breathing, but soon it developed into chills, a fever, and a terribly uncontrollable cough too. Soon though, entire spore colonies started to form on these human beings as they dropped to the floor dead, and millions of tiny fungus started to fill the vault. A panic ensued as these human beings began to transform into what we called spore crawlers, covered from head to toe in green with strange appendages growing out of them. Not sure how to handle the situation, the remaining residents that were unaffected set off a gas explosion which only angered the monsters more, which started to viciously tear the survivors limb from limb, screeching in pain. But by what seemed like a stroke of luck, 118 survivors were able to somehow escape the vault without succumbing to the onslaught. And from there, they formed a small tribe that banded together and headed north to Utah, eventually making their way to Zion Canyon. Here, they found a small group of Mexican refugees who they swiftly slaughtered. Mothers, children, and anyone in the camp they could get their hands on was decimated, all in an attempt to seemingly get more supplies for themselves to stay alive. However, this was an especially strange and violent act for vault dwellers, people who are usually considered the babies of the wasteland. And a nearby native of Utah, Randall Clark, thought the same, which is why he started to spy on them and their new camp, after which he noticed everyone was endlessly coughing with some strange sickness, and many were starting to glow green. But most horrifying of all, Randall discovered that inside the camp, the Vault 22 descendants were actually eating the Mexican people alive. Utter disgust swept over Randall, and he went into an all-out war with the intruders, killing as many of them as possible, while a majority managed to flee, with no further updates being known. Without a doubt, it's one of the most insane and horrifying stories in Fallout Vault history, and goes to show that even the facilities created with the best intentions always devolve into something much more sick and twisted. And now with many of these spore crawlers out in the wasteland spreading their fungus and infecting more people, it makes you wonder how many of the monsters we see out in the wasteland are due to radiation, and how many are nothing more than human beings performing unforgettable monstrosities, creating the spore crawlers or gulpers like Vault 4. When I think about the worst possible thing that could happen in vaults and Fallout, a lot of the time it comes down to not just detestable acts of violence or physical torture, but even more so, mental anguish. And what better way to cause something like that than the experiment that went on in Vault 106 from Fallout 3. Inside the vault, a horde of people were being contained under the watchful eye of scientists, where after only 10 days inside post the bombs falling in the Great War, the test was supposed to begin. Under the parameters, for 30 minutes, a set of highly potent psychoactive drugs were to be released into every chamber in the vault, causing mass hysteria and hallucination. And well, It worked. Multiple of the dwellers in the vault suddenly became enraged, along with seeing and hearing strange beings that were all around them. In an instant, some of them even began to gnaw away at their own bodies, or attack other innocent people around them, even family members. But most peculiar of all, the question around what these psychoactive drugs even are and the purpose of their testing comes into play. And well, we might just get our answer for what they were when we visit the vault 200 years later in Fallout 3. Because inside, we find that not only are there multiple dead bodies and scenes of torture, but those psychoactive drugs are still being pumped into the vault. It seems like what was supposed to be just a short test to study the effects of people losing their minds never actually stopped. And even more strange, as you start to explore the vault even more, it becomes apparent that the dead bodies aren't the only things down here. You find some people labeled as survivors that are still alive and in good mental standing, including a family trapped in a room fending for their lives. And it makes us start to ask the question, what exactly is going on here? And even more peculiar, if you get to the very bottom of the vault, you find an evil scientist in a lab coat still fully alive, presumably a person who was instrumental in the initial experiment. But remember, this vault is now over 200 years old, so anyone inside would presumably be the same age or more, and considering they aren't ghoulified, something really insane is going on. One explanation could be that the people inside are raiders or other explorers like yourself who came in to get a look and became trapped. But that wouldn't explain how they have been able to handle the non-stop barrage of this psychoactive drug for so long. After all, the initial experiment of only 30 minutes was supposed to turn most people into brainless monsters. So what if something even crazier was going on? Maybe while these drugs were surely supposed to kill most people, they weren't supposed to affect everyone. And what if these tests being done here were actually something that made a lot of sense for Vault Tech and their research? Immortality. Maybe the psychoactive drugs were designed to not affect a certain portion of the Vault population and instead allow them to survive forever. It would explain the scientists at the very bottom of the Vault and the helpless family surviving for so long with no food and supplies. And it really makes you wonder, how many other Vault experiments that we have not seen of or heard of have potential crazy twists like this? Because at the end of the day, whether it be Vault Tech or the old war government and enclaves secretly pulling the strings, things like this would perfectly make sense for their theorized end goals of either having a complete monopoly forever over Earth or escaping into the stars. After all, what better way to retain control than to live forever? And what better way to live forever than to test your serums first on some unsuspecting and innocent Vault dwellers? Everyone has their vices, and for many of us, those vices become an addiction that is life-crippling and hard to break. But luckily for the residents of Vault 95 from Fallout 4, they were given a chance at redemption for their sins. Touted as a state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility center, Vault 95 for the first 5 years after the bombs fell served as an amazing place not only for people to relax, but also for them to slowly work through withdrawals to some of the hardest chems and drugs out there. As to be expected though, this paradise didn't last forever. Because as intended in this Vault experiment, after 5 years of perfect rehabilitation for most of the residents, a monkey's wrench was thrown into the mix. A Vault Tech agent inside, posing the entire time as one of the residents, had secretly stashed away a massive mix of chems in his room. And now, only a couple of years after the facility's initial inception, it was time for him to wreak havoc. Quickly revealing the stash of drugs to everyone else in the vault, in no time, a select handful immediately relapsed and started to huff and inject everything in sight, becoming maddened and drug-induced maniacs. For others, they locked themselves in their room and covered their ears as they heard the screams of fighting and riots outside, begging themselves to keep their promises to stay sober. And for even more people, it quickly became apparent that this entire vault was nothing but a ruse, and they took up arms and started to kill or damage any Vault Tech property in sight. As the fumes of countless chems filled the air, along with blood and gore, those hiding in their rooms quickly realized that they had not been offered redemption at all, but rather a one-way ticket to hell. Just another example of the sadistic lengths Vault Tech would go to, all in an effort to get research and simply have what they would call fun, preying on other people's biggest weaknesses in their most dire times of need.